Hello there. Wherever you are, perhaps settling into bed, reclining in a quiet chair, or listening gently as your thoughts begin to slow, I'd like to welcome you to another quiet journey through the distant corners of human history. Tonight, we're going back to a time of muddy streets and flickering lamplight, a time of false hope, hard labor, and restless dreams. This is the story of the gold rush boomtowns, those curious, chaotic places that sprang from nothing, ballooned with people and promise, and often disappeared just as quickly. But we won't be rushing. There'll be no stampede here. Together, we'll move slowly through the daily lives of the miners, cooks, gamblers, and newspapermen. We'll meet the figures who made these towns flourish or fall. We'll ponder lost mines, dusty ledgers, and heavy boots caked with weeks of mud. And we'll end, eventually, in the softer corners of this rugged world. In the curtained rooms and creaky beds of those who made lives in a time where everything was uncertain except the night. So, take a breath. Settle in. Let's begin our journey with the simple, difficult, and often disappointing life of a miner in 1849. Imagine yourself waking before dawn, your breath visible in the thin, dry air of a California valley. There's a chill to the morning, even though the sun will soon bring heat that bakes the soil and stirs up the flies. You stretch, stiff from sleep, on the rough floor of a canvas tent, or, if you're luckier, a board shack with gaps between the slats wide enough for dust to drift through. Your bed, such as it is little more than a wool blanket laid across some straw or perhaps pine boughs. The scent of smoke and sweat is familiar. It never really leaves. Outside, the camp is already awake. Men cough, boots scrape. Someone swears softly as they light a fire that won't catch. The rhythm of the day is beginning, and it will be a long one. You're a miner in the California gold rush, not the kind from the stories, the ones who strike it rich with a single shining nugget, but the other kind, the common kind. The kind that digs and pans and hauls and strains and finds very little. The labor is constant. You work a narrow pan through cold, rushing water, swirling gravel and silt in circles, hoping that something heavier settles to the bottom. Your hands are red and cracked from cold water and rough gravel. Your back aches from crouching. Your eyes sting from the constant glare of sunlight off the surface of the stream. If you're not panning, you're digging. The earth is dry and reluctant, or wet and heavy, never quite cooperative. Shovels bend, pickaxes chip. You curse softly under your breath and keep going. The food is plain, and it's often spoiled. Beans, salted pork, hardtack if you're lucky. Fresh vegetables are a rare luxury. Coffee is brewed black and bitter, often with gritty grounds that settle in your teeth. But it's warm, and it keeps you going. And then there's the hope, the thing that brought you here, that brought everyone here, the golden dream. Each day, you tell yourself, might be the day, but most days are not. Most days yield a few dull flakes, perhaps a nugget no larger than a fingernail, enough to keep going. Not enough to leave. Around you, the camp grows. More tents, more noise. A general store opens, selling shovels, boots, and whiskey at astonishing prices. Some miners abandon the streams and take up trading or gambling instead. Others disappear into the hills, chasing new rumors. Disease spreads easily in the camp fevers, coughs, things that aren't named yet. There are no doctors. A man might lie sweating in his tent for days and then be gone. His tools are quietly taken by someone else. His place by the stream becomes theirs. And still, each day, the rhythm repeats. Wake, walk, dig, hope, sleep. The gold rush Boomtown is no place of ease. It is a place of labor and illusion, of people chasing something glittering they may never touch. And yet, they keep going. One more pen, one more dig, one more day. As you wipe the dirt from your face and peer once again into the swirling water, you wonder, is it in there? Probably not. But maybe. Not all who came west in the gold rush were miners. Some, perhaps more wisely, came not for the gold buried in the ground, but for the gold hidden in opportunity. Imagine yourself walking through a bustling San Francisco street in the early 1850s. The air is dry and tinged with the salt of the nearby sea. Horses clop slowly down mud-slicked roads, and the smell of dust, smoke, and pine wood mingles with the sharper tang of unwashed crowds and open fish barrels. This is a city still trying to become one hastily nailed together, noisy, and newly born. And amid the chaos, a young man named Levi Strauss is quietly setting up shop. He was born Aldeb Strauss in Buttenheim, Bavaria, in 1829, the youngest of 7 children in a Jewish family. His father, a peddler, died of tuberculosis when Levi was just a boy. Life in Bavaria offered little promise for young Jewish tradesmen, and so, like so many others, Levi and his family sought something better. In 1847, they boarded a ship for New York. In those early days, Levi helped his brothers in their dry goods business. He learned to sell, to observe what people needed, and perhaps more importantly, what they lacked. But by 1853, with the gold rush in full swing and San Francisco exploding with commerce, Levi made a choice. He would go west. Not to mine, but to sell to miners. Picture him as he arrives. Young, composed, his German accent still sharp, but his business sense already well honed. He brings bolts of fabric, rolls of canvas, simple tools, and other basic necessities, none of it glamorous, all of it essential. He is not alone. Dozens, hundreds of other traders crowd the docks and streets of the city. But Levi is observant. He listens. He adapts. And he notices something. The miners, the men working deep in riverbeds and rocky ravines, complain that their clothes wear out far too quickly. The pockets tear, the knees rip. The seams split under the strain of labor. They need something stronger. And so, Levi begins experimenting. The popular story is that he first sold trousers made from tent canvas. Whether or not that's precisely true, we do know he began working with denim, a tough cotton twill fabric dyed a deep, comforting indigo, thick, durable. It held up where other pants did not. But the real turning point came with a customer, Jacob Davis, a tailor in Nevada. Davis had the idea to reinforce the weak points of trousers like pockets and seams with small metal rivets. The concept was clever, but Davis needed a business partner to patent and produce it at scale. He turned to Levi Strauss. In 1873, the two men patented the design. Riveted denim work pants were born, and a small innovation quietly reshaped working-class clothing across the American West. But Levi's life wasn't built on a single stroke of genius. It was steady, thoughtful, generous even. He invested in community institutions, donated to orphanages, and remained deeply involved in Jewish charities. He never married. He never mined. He built something solid, something lasting, without the noise and risk of the gold fields. By the time of his death in 1902, Levi Strauss had become one of the most respected men in San Francisco. His name was stitched not only into trousers, but into the fabric of the city itself. And though the gold boom had faded and the feverish towns had begun to vanish, Levi's creation remained. Quietly, practically, enduring. His trousers, those humble riveted work pants, were not glamorous, not golden, but they worked. And they were what the miners needed. And sometimes that's the real treasure. The American West has always held a special place for stories about things that were almost found. Lost lakes, phantom mountains, hidden caves full of treasure. And among these is the quiet, persistent legend of the lost Blue Bucket Mine, a tale that flickers at the edge of memory, always just out of reach. Our story begins not in a gold rush town, but on a trail. The year is 1845. A group of emigrants, men, women, and children, are following the overland route west toward the promise of Oregon. They are exhausted, sunburned, and anxious, guiding heavy wagons over rocky terrain and across dry plains. At some point during their journey, they veer from the main trail. Accounts differ, as such stories often do, but they are likely somewhere in what is now eastern Oregon or possibly even northern California. Their goal? To take what they believed was a shortcut. A decision that would, as so often happened in the wilderness, lead them into difficulty. As the story goes, during a break from travel, a few children from the group go down to a nearby creek to fetch water. They carry with them a blue bucket, the only notable detail preserved with unusual consistency in nearly every version of the story. When the children return, the bucket is filled with pebbles, small, unusually heavy ones. The adults glance at them, remark on the strange weight, and think little more of it. The rocks are dumped out. The journey continues. Only later weeks or months afterward do some members of the group, now settled safely in Oregon, come across a sample of gold ore. And something about it seems familiar. The color, the shape, the weight. Realization, slow and aching, dawns. Those weren't just pebbles. The children, in their innocence, had filled their blue bucket with raw gold. And so the legend begins. Over the following decades, countless people set out to find the fabled source of the blue bucket gold. No one could quite agree where the event had taken place. Some believed it was near the Malheur River. Others pointed to the John Day Basin, or even parts of the Deschutes. The geography was vague, the landscape vast and shifting, and the account passed by word of mouth grew murky with each telling. But the promise of untouched riches waiting quietly in the Oregon wilderness was enough to fuel expeditions for years. Many claimed to have found it. Most came back empty-handed. Others didn't come back at all. The tale of the lost Blue Bucket Mine took on a life of its own. It was printed in newspapers, retold in saloons, and carefully transcribed in the journals of hopeful wanderers. It became a kind of American mirage, both possible and impossible, always just over the next ridge. And yet, like so many stories from this era, the most compelling part may not be the mystery, but what it reveals about the people who kept it alive. The blue bucket didn't just hold ore. It held the dream that something wonderful could be stumbled upon by chance, by accident, by children simply fetching water. That the harshness of the trail, the long journey, the aching loss might one day be rewarded in a moment so quiet you could miss it if you weren't paying attention. And perhaps that's why the legend has never fully faded, because gold wasn't always measured in nuggets. Sometimes it was measured in stories. And the lost blue bucket mine, found once, forgotten, and forever searched for, remains one of the most enduring. The saloon is one of the most enduring images of the American West, and while it's often depicted with gunfights and rowdy cowboys, the truth, like most things in history, is both quieter and more complicated. Imagine yourself now stepping into the saloon of a bustling gold rush town, perhaps in the Sierra foothills or along a muddy street in Nevada. It's early evening. The sun has begun to sink, casting long shadows between the hastily built wooden buildings. The air cools slightly, though dust still lingers from the day's foot traffic. The saloon door, perhaps those familiar swinging half doors, or more likely a full wooden slab, is pushed open. Inside, the space is dim but warm, illuminated by oil lamps and flickering candles on scarred tabletops. The air is thick with smoke tobacco mostly, mixed with the sharper scent of kerosene and stale beer. At the back of the room, a piano player taps out a melody, not the polished elegance of a concert hall, but something simpler. A repetitive tune, worn into muscle memory, played to fill the silence between the clinking of glasses and the murmurs of conversation. You might think of chaos and shouting, but in truth, most saloons operated in a steady rhythm, especially in the early evening. Miners, weary from a long day of digging, trickled in for a drink, a seat, and perhaps a quiet game of cards. Some leaned heavily on the bar, boots caked with mud, faces streaked with dust, ordering the usual, whiskey that was often cut with whatever the barkeep had on hand: tea, pepper, turpentine. The taste burned, but it was warm, and warm was enough. Others gathered around card tables. Poker, faro, or vingt-un. The chips clacked softly, and the cards snapped gently against the worn felt. The stakes were often modest and rarely fair. Dealers didn't always play clean, and some games were rigged from the start, but most patrons understood the unspoken rules. This wasn't about winning, not really. It was about passing time, letting the night drift by in comfort and dim companionship. In a corner, two men might argue over a hand, but rarely did it escalate. Most patrons knew that violence invited attention, and attention invited sheriffs, or worse, vigilantes. For all the legends of wild shootouts, most saloon-goers preferred their drink without drama. And then there were the women. In many towns, women were few and far between. Those who worked in the saloons were often referred to as hurdy-gurdy girls or dance hall women. They weren't all sex workers, though some were. Many were simply paid to sit with patrons, dance a few songs, share a conversation, maybe a drink, always for a small fee. They brought color, presence, and something softer to the hard edges of Boomtown life. The saloon, for all its grit, was not just a place of indulgence. It was also a community center of sorts. It was where news was shared, new gold strikes, incoming supply wagons, rumors of land deals. Notices were tacked to walls. Mail might be delivered there. And in the absence of newspapers or telegraphs, the saloon was often the only place to hear what was happening in the world beyond the town's muddy streets. Some saloons even doubled as makeshift courthouses, meeting halls, or stages. Traveling performers might stop in for a single night, jugglers, musicians, speakers. And on such nights, the air would take on a rare kind of energy. Not frenzied, but hopeful. As if, for just an hour or two, something different might be possible. But the night always wound down. As the piano slowed and the whiskey burned low in the bottle, the saloon would quiet. Lamps were snuffed one by one. Patrons wandered out into the night, boots scuffing softly against the plank porch. And the saloon, empty now, would sit in stillness, waiting for the rhythm of the next day to begin again. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a refuge. And in a world where comfort was scarce, that was enough. Imagine yourself in the pre-dawn stillness of a Yukon mining camp. Snow crunches faintly beneath your boots. The cold is sharp and absolute. It reaches deep, past coat and gloves and scarf, and into your bones. The world is not quite awake. The sky is a slate-colored ceiling, just beginning to brighten at the edges. And here you are, already standing outside, shuffling stiffly toward the low, canvas-sided tent where the work begins. You are the camp cook. In the gold fields of the far north, especially during the Klondike gold rush of the late 1890s, the cook's job was not glamorous. It was relentless. And in a world ruled by frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion, it came with immense pressure. Your day starts hours before anyone else. You light the stoves if the fire hasn't gone out completely overnight. Your fingers move clumsily, half frozen, as you nurse the flames back to life with bits of bark and shredded paper. A good fire means hot coffee. A bad fire means grumbling men and worse, wasted food. Water must be melted from blocks of ice hauled the day before. There's no running tap, no quick boil. Everything takes time. Everything takes energy. The ingredients are limited. In this remote outpost, food arrives in crates hauled by dog sled or packed in by mule. That means sacks of flour, beans, dried peas, bacon, and the ever-present lard. If you're lucky, maybe a tin or two of dried fruit. Eggs are rare. Fresh vegetables, nearly unheard of. The challenge is not just feeding a dozen or more ravenous miners, it's doing it with monotony, day after day. You rotate between thick pancakes, sourdough biscuits, boiled beans, and bacon. The bread is often dense, dry at the edges, and sometimes cooked unevenly due to unpredictable stoves. And the stove itself? It's your worst enemy and your only friend. It needs constant feeding. The wood, split by someone else or perhaps by you, must be dry, even in this landscape where snow clings to every tree. You must balance the fire's heat to avoid burning breakfast, which, in a small tent filled with steam and soot, is harder than it sounds. There is no sink, no dish soap, no relief from the smells. Scorched bacon, boiled beans, the faint tang of unwashed socks drifting in from the sleeping quarters. Pans must be scrubbed with snow, sand, or old cloth. Water, when you can melt it, is reserved mostly for drinking. And when the men come in shoulders hunched, faces raw from the wind, they eat quickly. They don't thank you, not always. But they expect the food to be there, hot, hearty, filling. Once breakfast is over, the dishes are cleared, and then it's on to lunch, then dinner. Sometimes you get a break. Sometimes not. If someone's ill, if the weather turns, if the food spoils, it's your responsibility to make do. There is no backup plan. And at night, long after the last tin plate has been scraped and the last mug emptied, you sit by the stove, your boots steaming near the coals, your muscles aching in places you didn't know existed. Cooking for miners is thankless. It's constant. And in a place like the Yukon, where temperatures can plunge to 40 below, and the snow never seems to stop it, can feel like you're cooking for survival, not comfort. But in that harshness, there's something else. You become the heart of the camp. Your fire is the first thing they see in the morning. Your meals are the only warmth between the work and the cold. And though they may not say it out loud, the men know, without the cook, nothing else works. Even in this frozen corner of the world, the rhythm of the day begins and ends with you. It is easy to imagine gold rush towns as wild but sturdy places, rough-hewn, wooden structures with plank sidewalks, lively saloons, and stores stocked high with picks and coffee beans. But in truth, many of these towns were hastily built, overcrowded, and dangerously flammable. And no place better illustrates this than San Francisco in 1851. Imagine standing near Portsmouth Square in the spring of that year. The city is still young, just a few years past its quiet days as a Spanish mission outpost. Now, it's exploding with people. Miners, merchants, immigrants, gamblers, and preachers all crowd its narrow, muddy streets. Shanties lean on warehouses. Tents spill onto hillsides. The air is thick with dust by day and smoke by night. By 1851, the city has already burned several times. Small fires at first, then larger. But the worst is yet to come. The night of May 3rd begins like any other. But as the sky darkens, a single spark somewhere in a paint and upholstery shop on the corner of Kearny and Washington streets escapes containment. Within minutes, flames leap to the rooftops. The wind, strong and steady from the west, fans the fire across blocks of timber and tar paper. In a city made almost entirely of wood, with narrow streets and no organized fire department, the results are swift and devastating. Now, imagine it from the ground. You wake to shouting. Orange flickers dance across your tent walls. The air outside is already choking, heavy with smoke. People run not in panic, not yet, but with urgency. Buckets are filled. Barrels of water are rolled out. Volunteers form ragged lines, tossing water against the flames, but it's too late. The fire is alive. It leaps from roof to roof. It consumes homes, shops, boarding houses, and churches. Whole blocks vanish in the space of an hour. The heat is overwhelming, like standing before the mouth of a furnace. Roofs cave inward. Glass shatters. Crates explode into cinders. Some try to fight it. Others pack what they can and flee. Still others, unable to outrun the flames, simply stand and watch as their livelihoods vanish. In an attempt to halt the blaze, desperate citizens begin to blow up buildings, using kegs of black powder to create fire breaks. The explosions echo across the bay. But even this proves insufficient. The fire keeps coming. By morning, 17 city blocks are gone. Over 1,500 buildings destroyed. The business district is a smoldering shell. The losses are staggering millions of dollars in property, goods, and supplies. And yet, remarkably, few lives are lost. The fire was swift, but people moved quickly. Still, the aftermath is haunting. The city smells of wet ash and scorched canvas. Skeletons of buildings lean against one another. Smoke drifts lazily above ruined storefronts. The once crowded docks are silent. But something strange happens in the days that follow. Rebuilding begins almost immediately. San Franciscans, hardened already by the boom and bust rhythm of gold country, simply roll up their sleeves. Tents go up first, then wooden sheds. Sawmills run day and night. Debris is cleared with carts and wheelbarrows. Within a week, some merchants are already open again selling coffee, boots, and lumber for rebuilding. By June, it is as if the city refuses to remember the fire. It surges forward just as quickly as before. And that's perhaps the most revealing part of this moment in time, not the fire itself, but the resilience that followed it. San Francisco was a city built not just on gold, but on grit, on a willingness to endure, to rebuild, to try again, even if it might all burn down once more. Imagine yourself standing beside a rocky creek in the mid-1800s. You've just found a glittering flake in your pan. Your hands tremble slightly as you lift it from the mud. It's small, but bright sunlight dances across its surface. Could it be gold? Could this be the moment your fortune begins? But almost immediately, a shadow of doubt falls over you. What if it's not? What if it's fool's gold iron pyrite, so similar in shimmer but worthless? In the goldfields, the difference could mean everything. And so, like thousands of hopeful miners before you, you begin the process of testing with whatever tools, methods, or strange traditions you have on hand. The science of gold testing in the 19th century was a curious blend of chemistry, folklore, and desperation. Formal assays existed, of course, but in a remote mining camp, miles from the nearest laboratory, miners relied on simpler means. One of the most common? Biting it. Gold is soft, much softer than pyrite or quartz. A light bite would leave faint tooth marks on a real gold nugget, while fool's gold would resist, often crumbling or remaining hard. It was crude, unsanitary, and often unreliable, especially with flakes or gold mixed in quartz. Still, the bite test became iconic. If a miner was lucky enough to reach a larger town, he might visit an assayer, someone trained in more advanced methods. These men worked in dusty backrooms, surrounded by scales, crucibles, and bottles of strange, acrid-smelling liquids. One of the simplest tools of their trade: nitric acid. A drop placed on the sample would fizz and react with many imposters. Pyrite, copper, even certain types of brass, all would respond. But real gold was chemically inert. It would sit calmly, unaffected by the acid. A little island of certainty in a sea of hopeful guesses. Other methods were more theatrical. Some miners would heat their samples over a flame. Real gold would melt at a low, consistent temperature, bright, buttery, and unmistakable. Fool's gold, by contrast, might spark or shatter. Still, others carried tiny touchstones, flat, dark stones, against which the sample was rubbed. The mark it left, when treated with acid, could indicate gold content. These were often used by traveling traders or buyers who needed to make quick judgments. But not all testing was scientific. In boomtowns, where rumor often replaced reason, you'd hear all kinds of claims. Some believed that holding gold in your palm for a while would warm it faster than other metals. Others claimed they could tell by the sound a nugget made when dropped onto a table gold gave a duller thud than lighter metals. They said. Many simply relied on experience, the color, the feel, the way a flake clung to the bottom of a pan after hours of swirling water. For those who had been in the fields long enough, gold had a weight, a quiet certainty that no impostor could mimic. But even experts were sometimes fooled. The gold rush drew in conmen, counterfeiters, and self-proclaimed chemists who peddled miracle tests and fake samples. Gold dust was sometimes adulterated with sand or brass shavings to stretch a sale. Some miners, desperate for cash, even painted bits of lead to resemble nuggets. It was a strange dance between hope and skepticism, between science and guesswork. And in a time when wealth could be carried in the palm of a hand, the need to be sure was ever present. Today, with modern instruments and X-ray scans, we can identify gold with ease. But in those muddy creeks and smoky assay rooms, certainty came slowly drop by drop, mark by mark. And in every bite, every drop of acid, every glint under lamplight, you can still see the shape of that old question: is it real? Picture the early hours of the morning in a small frontier town. The sky is just beginning to brighten at the edges, a soft silver light creeping across a flat horizon. The wind is quiet, for now. The streets are still. And in the stage yard, the coach waits. A long wooden vehicle, narrow, high-wheeled, and more fragile than you might expect. Its paint is chipped, the leather trim weathered from dust storms and rain. It smells faintly of wood, sweat, and oil. You are the stagecoach driver known in the parlance of the time as a whip. Not because you use your whip constantly, though you carry one, but because you must know every twitch, turn, and signal of your team. Horses are your lifeblood. The road is your rhythm. Your day begins early, before passengers rise, before anyone boards. You check the harnesses, the wheels, the brake. You brush the horses, check their shoes, test the reins. On rough routes, even the smallest break or slipped buckle could mean disaster. There are no mechanics. If something fails, you fix it or you wait, stranded. Your horses, usually a team of 4 or 6, if you're crossing steep country, snort and stop as the coach is packed. Mailbags go in first, then parcels. Then passengers who clamber in awkwardly, clutching satchels, coats, and wide-brimmed hats. Inside, the bench seats are hard. The windows are canvas flaps, sometimes left open for air, more often tied down against dust. There is no suspension, not in the modern sense. The coach lurches and rattles with every stone. When you're finally ready, you climb up to the driver's box high above the road, beside the guard or shotgun messenger. He's armed, of course. Bandits are not an everyday threat, but they exist. His job is to protect the mail, the passengers, and you. You shout a quick command. The horses jolt forward, and the day begins. The journey is not swift. A stagecoach averages 5 to 8 miles per hour, depending on terrain. On some stretches, you switch teams every 10 or 15 miles at stations where fresh horses are waiting, often pre-harnessed and ready to go. The roads are rarely smooth. Dust clouds rise behind you on dry stretches. Mud sucks at the wheels after rain. Rivers may need fording. In mountain passes, the horses strain against the grade. The wind whistles. Rocks clatter beneath the wheels. Passengers try to sleep or read or talk. Some clutch handkerchiefs over their noses. The ride jostles everyone. It's not uncommon for heads to bump against the coach's frame or elbows to collide during sudden turns. You remain focused, eyes scanning the trail, hands steady on the reins. You watch the horses constantly feeling the pull, listening for changes in breath, sensing when one begins to falter. You know their personalities, the eager one on the front right, the stubborn one at rear left. You adjust without thinking. At midday, you stop to rest. A quick meal, hardtack, cold beans, coffee if it's available. You stretch your legs. Check the wheels. Examine the harnesses again. Then you press on. The day is long. You cross canyons, rattling over wooden trestle bridges. You pass quiet towns, lone cabins, and long stretches of wilderness where the only sounds are birds, wind, and the steady clop of hooves. Rain might come. The passengers shift under oilcloths. You pull your hat lower, squinting into the storm. The road becomes slick, but you drive on. Evening settles slowly. Shadows grow long across the trail. Somewhere in the distance, wolves begin to howl. Your guard shifts in his seat, scanning the ridgeline. At last, you pull into the next station. Your arms ache. Your clothes are stiff with sweat and dust. The horses are led away. The passengers step down, sore and silent. You dismount, pat the horses one last time, and begin the process of preparing for the next leg. Because tomorrow, you'll do it again. The life of a stagecoach driver is not heroic. It's repetitive, demanding, and deeply solitary. But in a land still carving roads through rock and forest, drivers are lifelines. Without them, there is no mail, no movement, no connection between distant places, just silence. And so, the next day, when the sky begins to lighten, you'll climb back into the box, take up the reins, and drive on. Close your eyes and imagine yourself once again on a hillside near a river in 1850s California. The sound of water rushing over stones, the clink of metal pans, the occasional shout of success or disappointment. And scattered along the riverbanks, slightly apart from the others, are clusters of Chinese miners. Dressed in linen tunics, broad-brimmed straw hats to block the sun, sleeves rolled high. They work in rhythm quiet, efficient, focused. They are thousands of miles from home. The first wave of Chinese migrants arrived in the United States around 1849, drawn by tailies of Gold Mountain, the Chinese name for California. They came from rural villages in Guangdong province, where poverty and civil unrest made survival uncertain. They did not come with delusions of sudden wealth. Most planned only to stay a few years, save what they could, and return home. They came prepared to work patiently, methodically, and without complaint. But from the beginning, their presence stirred resentment. White miners, many of whom had already begun to struggle with dwindling gold supplies, saw the Chinese not as fellow laborers, but as competitors. And soon, hostility took form in laws, taxes, and violence. In 1850, California passed a foreign miners' tax targeted mainly at the Chinese, Mexican, and South American workers. Though the tax was repealed and reinstated in various forms, it often required foreign-born miners to pay as much as $20 per month simply for the right to dig. For a miner, making perhaps a few dollars a day, sometimes nothing, this was crushing. But still, the Chinese workers endured. They formed their own mining groups, pooling resources and labor. Often, they would work claims that had been abandoned by others deemed played out. And yet, through careful sifting, recycling tailings, and coordinated teamwork, they often managed to extract what others had missed. It was quiet success, modest, earned without recognition. They lived in separate camps, often on the fringes of towns or along remote riverbanks. Their tents were orderly. Their meals, steamed rice, dried fish, preserved vegetables, cooked over low fires. They held on to their traditions, celebrating festivals, honoring ancestors, and maintaining the rhythms of home as best they could. But the prejudice did not fade. Newspapers depicted them in crude caricatures. Laws excluded them from testifying in court. Mobs sometimes drove entire Chinese communities out of town with little warning. Beatings and thefts were common, occasionally worse. Despite this, many stayed, and many built lives amid the harshness. Some left the goldfields and became launderers, cooks, shopkeepers, or railroad workers. They built temples, schools, and mutual aid societies. They buried their dead with ceremony, even when burial space had to be rented in segregated corners of town cemeteries. And still, the larger history often forgot them. But their contribution to the gold rush was immense, not only in labor, but in resilience. In the face of rejection, they built community. In the shadow of injustice, they kept working. And even when driven from the hills, they left something behind, a quieter kind of legacy. If you walk some of those riverbanks today, you may still find evidence of their presence. Carefully placed stones, reworked channels, small artifacts buried in silt. The subtle fingerprints of people who were never truly welcomed, but who shaped the land just the same. They did not find gold in the way they had hoped, but they brought with them something just as enduring: patience, discipline, survival. And in a world that often turned its back on them, they endured with grace. It is a calm morning on the main street of a gold rush town. The sun is rising above the rooftops, casting warm yellow light across dusty windows. Wagons creak slowly through the street, and already men are lining up not at the mines, but outside a long, low building with a wooden sign hanging over the door. The sign might read, "Dry Goods and Provisions," or simply, "Store." Inside, the air is cool and crowded. There is no music, no luxury, just the scent of cloth, flour, lamp oil, and leather. Behind the counter, beneath shelves stacked with every imaginable necessity, stands the merchant. Not a miner, not a gambler, but in many ways, the one person most likely to get rich in a boomtown. From the earliest days of the California gold rush, it became clear that the real profits weren't always found in gold dust, but in beans, boots, and blankets. In a town of men obsessed with digging, the person selling shovels and soup could name their price. The typical merchant carried an astonishing array of goods. Think of it as an early version of the general store, a one-stop shop for survival. Flour in canvas sacks, pickled eggs in jars, coffee beans by the pound, long rolls of fabric, buckets, candles, tin plates, rope, whiskey, tobacco, dried peaches, sugar, and salt tools of every kind, hammers, pans, chisels, and, always, boots. The roads tore them apart quickly. Prices were high, very high. In 1850s California, a single egg could cost the equivalent of several dollars in today's money. A shovel might cost 5 to 10 times what it would back east. And people paid, because they had no choice. Merchants were often practical and alert, always watching which goods sold fastest, which trends were rising. If a flood damaged the supply routes, they raised prices. If rumors of a new strike brought a wave of new arrivals, they ordered more stock. Some merchants stayed behind their counters. Others grew more ambitious. They bought property, opened second shops, partnered with shippers, invested in freighting companies, or bought up land near future town sites. And a few became legends. Levi Strauss, for instance, didn't pan for gold. He sold canvas and denim to miners' fabric tough enough to survive weeks in the dirt. His company would become a cornerstone of American fashion, but it started as a dry goods business in Boomtown, San Francisco. Another name was Samuel Brannan. When gold was first discovered, Brannan didn't rush to the hills. He bought every pickaxe and pan he could find in the city, then stood in the streets shouting about gold to stir up excitement. As the miners stampeded inland, he sold them the tools at enormous markups. He became California's first millionaire. Still, most merchants were quieter folk. People who came not to strike it rich, but to make a steady living. People who opened early, closed late, kept the ledger by hand, and tried to balance fair pricing with survival. Their stores were more than businesses. They were hubs, places where letters were dropped off, news was exchanged, boots were patched, and disputes quietly settled. The merchant's life wasn't easy. Supplies could run out. Robberies happened. Fires could erase everything. And in a boom and bust economy, today's fortune could become tomorrow's debt. But compared to the grueling uncertainty of prospecting, it offered something else: stability. A roof, a regular income, a chance to build something lasting. And so, while others chased dreams in the dirt, the merchant stayed put, counting beans, measuring cloth, and turning gold not into wealth, but into shelves, stoves, and strong foundations. In the chaotic sprawl of gold-rush towns, amid the noise of hammers and hooves, the echo of a piano in a saloon, and the clink of whiskey glasses, there was also something softer, faint church bells, or the gentle murmur of a hymn drifting out from a tent with a wooden cross. Religion followed the gold rush, not always loudly, and not always successfully, but with quiet determination. Where prospectors went, so too did preachers, missionaries, and lay ministers. They came not to dig, but to heal, to guide, to build something more lasting than wealth. Imagine, if you will, a small, makeshift chapel at the edge of a dusty town. The walls are canvas or rough timber, and the benches inside are just planks balanced on stumps. A borrowed Bible rests on a crate-turned pulpit. There may not be a cross on the wall, just a lantern and a cup of water. Still, on a Sunday morning, a small group gathers. Some are devout, having carried their faith with them across mountains and oceans. Others come from curiosity, loneliness, or habit. A few slip in after a long Saturday night, hoping for a moment of calm. The preacher stands hat in hand, coat patched at the elbow, and begins to speak. He does not thunder from the pulpit. He talks plainly, quietly, of temptation, of forgiveness, of home. He reads aloud from Psalms. A woman with a worn shawl leads a hymn in a wavering voice. There are no stained glass windows, no polished pews. Just a hush and a space to remember something gentler. Some towns had Catholic priests, others Protestant ministers, Jewish rabbis, or even Buddhist monks, depending on the population. In towns with Chinese workers, small altars were built to honor ancestors, set up in corners of bunkhouses or behind kitchens. Missionaries ventured out to mining camps and indigenous villages, traveling on foot or by mule. They brought tracts, scriptures, and sometimes food or medicine. Some were compassionate, others overzealous. A few tried to teach reading and writing. Others focused on conversion, often with mixed results. In the more established towns, churches were eventually built from lumber, painted white, and trimmed with simple steeples. They doubled as schools, meeting halls, and shelters in winter storms. But religion in the gold fields was never simple. Many miners distrusted clergy, viewing them as outsiders or moralizers. Others felt that faith had no place in the dirty, often violent world of gold mining. And yet, when illness struck, or when a child died in a mining camp, it was often the minister or priest who was called for, if not for doctrine, then for comfort. Moral reformers also arrived, often women. They came to run missions, open temperance halls, or create homes for fallen women. These spaces offered support to women working in saloons or brothels, offering lodging, sewing jobs, or prayer. Some accepted the help, others resisted. But the effort was there, a quiet countercurrent to the louder rhythms of gold country life. In some towns, spiritual life and secular life coexisted uneasily. On one corner, a saloon; on the next, a chapel. Saturday night might end in gambling. Sunday morning might begin in prayer. For many, these contradictions were simply part of life. Because in a world as unpredictable as a gold rush town, faith offered structure, a reason to rest one day a week, a reminder of home, a promise that something larger existed beyond gold dust and timber shacks. These churches and missions were not grand, but they were anchoring points, places where weary miners could sit in silence, where songs were sung without instruments, where forgiveness was offered quietly, without much ceremony. In time, some of these simple wooden chapels would become the oldest surviving buildings in their towns. Others vanished entirely, their locations marked only by memories or by a rusted bell left lying in the grass. Yet the spirit they carried of comfort, of conscience, of calm remained. Not in the gold taken from the earth, but in the words whispered over it. Imagine yourself standing in a mining camp at midday. The air is dry and the sun rests high overhead. Around you, men dig, haul, and panmost dressed in the uniform of hard labor, coarse shirts, suspenders, and boots caked in dust. Fashion in the traditional sense seems absent here. There are no gowns, no lace, no polished shoes. But look a little closer and you'll find a world of careful choices, practical adaptations, and quiet signals stitched into every cuff and collar. In the earliest days of the California gold rush, most newcomers arrived wearing whatever they had at home. For East Coast Americans, that meant wool trousers, linen shirts, and perhaps a tailcoat. For European immigrants, loose peasant blouses and canvas work pants were common. Chinese miners often wore homespun tunics, blue sashes, and cloth shoes reinforced with straw soles. But the gold fields demanded something different. Within weeks of arrival, most miners abandoned fashion in favor of function. Trousers tore on brambles and rocks. Dress shoes fell apart in the mud. Starched collars melted in the heat. Clothing became rugged, layered, and built to survive. Enter denim. Though Levi Strauss is the most famous name associated with gold rush fashion, the idea of durable canvas or twill work pants predated him. Early miners often reinforced their trousers with leather patches at the knees, or stitched rivets at points of strained small inventions that made daily life easier. Strauss merely perfected the idea and gave it a name: blue jeans. These garments were not just tough, they were status symbols of a different sort. A clean, well-mended pair of trousers said you weren't destitute. A quality belt or hat hinted at recent success. Boots in good condition spoke of planning, of foresight. Hats, in particular, told stories. The iconic wide-brimmed slouch hat was worn for shade and rain. The more formal bowler, favored by gamblers and shopkeepers, lent a sense of uprightness. Some wore caps or scarves, often for warmth or to block dust. And then there were the women. Though far fewer in number, women in gold rush towns faced their own fashion dilemmas. Eastern dresses, layered, corseted, and delicate, were nearly impossible to maintain in mining camps. So women adapted. Many wore simpler calico gowns with aprons and sunbonnets. Those who worked as cooks, laundresses, or merchants often shortened their skirts and wore boots instead of slippers. Some adopted trousers under skirts for added warmth and modesty. Chinese women wore traditional silk jackets, sometimes embroidered with subtle patterns, even when the fabric faded. And not all clothing was what it seemed. In some cases, disguise became survival. A small number of women dressed as men to gain access to mines or protection while traveling. In such attire, they could pass through towns unnoticed, safer from unwanted attention. Others worked in male-dominated trades under assumed identities, revealing their true gender only years later, if at all. Similarly, outlaws and gamblers often dressed far above their station, wearing suits and cravats in the saloon to project wealth they didn't have. Swindlers arrived in dusty clothes and rags, then changed into polished boots and satin waistcoats when playing the part of a gentleman. In these towns, clothing was a kind of armor against the elements, yes, but also against judgment. It hid poverty. It suggested success. It helped blend in, or helped one stand out. And despite the grime and dust, fashion still evolved. As towns stabilized, tailors opened shops, and catalogs arrived by ship or rail, offering patterns from New York and Paris. Some merchants stocked ribbons and perfume. A few even sold corsets and crinolines, though few could afford or wear such things comfortably. But more than anything, the clothing of the goldfields tells us this. Even in the roughest places, people cared about how they looked, because appearance wasn't just vanity, it was communication. A miner's rolled sleeves, a laundress's apron tied tight, a gambler's gleaming boots, a preacher's clean collar. Each told you something. Each helped shape identity in a world still being built from scratch. Picture a gold rush town at dusk. The main street is quiet now, save for the clink of glasses in the saloon and the low murmur of voices. A lantern swings from a post. The sheriff's office, if there is one, may be no more than a small cabin with a desk, a cot, and a single set of rusted manacles. And somewhere, not far away, a crime has just been committed. A stolen horse, a rigged card game, a robbery gone wrong. Maybe something worse. Now ask yourself, who's in charge of justice? In the earliest days of the gold rush, the answer was often no one. The rush of people into places like California and the Yukon far outpaced the creation of formal law enforcement. Towns sprang up overnight, and the nearest judge or constable might be hundreds of miles away. In the absence of formal courts, people did what they had always done when no one was watching. They made their own rules. Some towns held informal trials. A jury of local men, a hastily assembled crowd, and a judge who might also run the general store. The rules were inconsistent, the punishment swift. Fines, public shaming, banishment, or in more serious cases execution. This was rough justice, born of necessity, fear, and a strong desire to protect property and reputation. But soon, a more organized, though no less unsettling form of justice emerged: vigilante committees. In San Francisco, for example, the Committee of Vigilance was formed in 1851, and again in 1856. These groups were composed of concerned citizens, merchants, clerks, former soldiers who felt the official legal system was too slow, too corrupt, or too ineffective to keep order. They set up their own courts, held secret meetings, conducted surveillance, and carried out punishments, including hangings, without appeal. It was, to many, a form of communal protection. But it was also deeply dangerous. Because when justice is carried out in the absence of law, it is shaped by fear, anger, and assumption. Accusations could come with no evidence. A wrong look, a whispered rumor, or a past debt could put someone's life at risk. Ethnic minorities, particularly Chinese immigrants, Mexicans, and Native Americans, were especially vulnerable. Rarely allowed to testify, frequently targeted, and often denied even the pretense of due process. Yet the vigilantes were sometimes celebrated. In towns plagued by theft, murder, or fraud, they were seen as heroes, men who took action when no one else would. But what kind of justice is born in the dark? Many towns eventually did develop formal systems. Sheriffs were elected. Courthouses were built. Jails, tiny, drafty, and often escape-prone, were constructed. Some towns brought in circuit judges who rode from settlement to settlement hearing cases by lamplight in dusty rooms. Even so, justice remained inconsistent. A well-dressed merchant might be let off with a warning. A poor drifter might face harsh punishment for a similar offense. And where gold was concerned, loyalties shifted quickly. Gamblers were sometimes welcomed as entertainment, other times run out of town. Saloon owners might be respected or reviled. Laws were often written on the fly, posted to the wall of a tavern, then changed the next week. Punishments ranged from the symbolic like placing a sign around someone's neck and parading them through town to the severe, whipping, branding, or public hanging. All were carried out with a disturbing blend of ceremony and spontaneity. Still, in the minds of many, justice, however imperfect, was a necessity. Something to hold chaos at bay. Something to remind people that even in the wilderness, some line must be drawn. Over time, as towns grew into cities and states were formed, vigilante justice faded. Formal courts, proper trials, and official law enforcement took its place. But the legacy of that era lingers. In old journals and frontier newspapers, you can find the names of men tried and sentenced by committees. The records are sparse, the evidence thin, the punishments final. And in quiet cemeteries at the edges of boomtowns, there are graves marked with little more than a date and the word hanged. In the end, boomtown justice was not about right and wrong, but about control. And where gold was concerned, people did what they thought they had to, even if no one was left to answer for it afterward. Imagine the inside of a boarding house in a gold-rush town, not a grand hotel, but a long wooden structure with narrow walls, low ceilings, and floors that creak with every step. The light is dim, filtered through worn curtains. Somewhere, a kettle whistles faintly, and the air carries the comforting scent of soap, old wood, and bread crusts. This is where many lived, not in tents or lean-tos, but in the shared domestic spaces cobbled together by necessity and care. Boarding houses were among the first semi-permanent buildings to appear in a boomtown. Run by widows, entrepreneurial women, or families looking for steady income, they offered something that most miners desperately missed: a bed, a roof, and a meal. Rooms were often little more than narrow stalls, separated by thin wooden planks, a mattress stuffed with straw or horsehair, a wool blanket, sometimes infested with lice, a basin and pitcher, a single candle or oil lamp for light, and no privacy. Walls were thin. Snoring and coughing were constant companions. Conversations could be heard across hallways. But compared to sleeping under the stars or in a cramped tent, it was a small luxury. The real center of the house, though, was the kitchen. Here, the landlady, or sometimes a hired cook, would prepare meals for a dozen or more hungry lodgers. The menu was simple and repetitive: beans, biscuits, boiled beef, potatoes, coffee. On special days, perhaps stewed apples or canned peaches. Everything was cooked on a wood-burning stove in heavy iron pots. Dishes were scrubbed in tin basins. Water had to be hauled in buckets from wells or barrels, sometimes carried a dozen yards in either direction. Bathing, too, was an exercise in patience. There were no proper bathrooms. Instead, bucket baths were the norm. A large tin tub, often placed in the kitchen or a spare room, was filled with warm water and used in turn. The first bather had it best. The last, well, not so much. Soap was homemade or bought in rough bars. Towels were shared. Privacy was optional. Laundry was done by hand, often by Chinese or indigenous workers, or by women who turned washing into a business of its own. Clothes were boiled, scrubbed on washboards, rinsed in cold water, and hung on lines behind the house, where they flapped in the dust-laden breeze. Despite the hardships, these homes mattered deeply. They provided warmth during long winters, a place to gather, a chance to sit at a table, hear news, play cards, or sip weak coffee in companionable silence. The boarding house was more than shelter. It was a sliver of stability in a transient world. Some were orderly, others were chaotic. A few were known for good food, others for rough company. And many were a mix of the two, offering comfort in some corners, tension in others. As towns grew, boarding houses evolved. Curtains were added. Beds were replaced. More permanent walls went up. Some even offered small libraries, parlor rooms, or spaces for music and reading. They were the early seeds of hotels, apartments, and community centers. And they were shaped, always, by the quiet labor of those who ran them. Mostly women, often unseen, rising before dawn to bake bread, staying up late to mend linens, keeping the fire going on cold nights. They were chasing gold, but they made life possible for those who did. Evenings were the gentlest time. You might find a miner reading a tattered newspaper by lamplight, a shop clerk mending a shirt, a gambler quietly shuffling cards at the corner table. Outside, the wind sighs. The boarding house creaks as it settles into night. And in that hush, surrounded by dust and exhaustion, something like home begins to take shape. Not perfect, not clean, but human, and, in its own way, enduring. Picture it. The wind whispers through empty doorways. A shutter bangs loosely against a weathered wall. Dust gathers in windowsills. The footprints have long since blown away. This is what remains when a gold rush ends. Ghost towns, quiet skeletons of a past that once burned bright, scattered across the hills of California, the valleys of Colorado, the frozen reaches of the Yukon, and the red dust of the Australian outback. These are the faded remains of once thriving boomtowns that blinked into existence with gold and faded just as quickly when the gold was gone. Some towns lasted only a year or two. Others endured for a generation, but the story is always the same. Gold was discovered. People arrived. Life exploded. Then, it all vanished. Imagine walking the empty main street of such a town. The wooden sidewalks sag with age. The buildings, many of them still standing, lean inward like tired shoulders. A saloon door hangs crooked. Inside, a few broken bottles, the outlines of tables long removed. In the corner, a faded piano with no keys left to play. The schoolhouse still holds a chalkboard, scratched faintly with sums from a lesson taught 130 years ago. A single rusted boot rests in the dust beside the hearth of a collapsed boarding house. And in the small cemetery at the edge of town, wooden markers tilt in the dry ground, some still legible, most not. The names worn away, the stories forgotten. This, too, is part of gold rush life, the afterlife of ambition. As the veins dried up or became too difficult to mine, people left. Some simply packed up what they could and walked away. Others tried to stay, shifting to ranching, farming, or freighting. But without gold, most towns lost their lifeblood. Stores closed. Stages stopped arriving. Saloons emptied. And what had once been a place of noise and promise became a memory in timber and dust. Some towns were dismantled, their lumber hauled away and reused elsewhere. Others burned in fires and were never rebuilt. But many remain, standing silently against the backdrop of hills and time. And not all who stayed did so voluntarily. In some places, graves outnumbered living souls long before the towns were abandoned. Epidemics, mining accidents, harsh winters, or violence claimed many who came chasing dreams. Their final resting places became part of the land itself. Yet these ghost towns, for all their stillness, still speak. Not with voices, but with details. The worn floorboards of a post office, a rusty frying pan left beside a cold hearth, a faded ledger on a cracked desk. Each item a trace of someone's ordinary day, someone's hopes, someone's version of home. In recent decades, many of these places have been preserved as historic sites, Bodie, California among the most famous. Others are untouched, accessible only by rough tracks or footpaths. Travelers who find them often describe a strange sensation, the sense that people just stepped out moments ago, though it's been 100 years. And maybe that's the most enduring truth about the gold rush. It wasn't just about wealth or fortune. It was about people trying to shape something out of dust, out of luck, out of sheer will. And even when they left, something stayed behind. A kind of echo. A reminder that even the loudest chapters of history eventually fall quiet. But in that silence, if you listen closely, you can still hear the creak of wagon wheels, the distant ring of a hammer, the low murmur of a miner's voice, not gone, just resting. And so, as we close our journey through life in a gold rush boomtown, may we carry a final thought, that beneath the frenzy, the hardship, and the gold itself, it was always about people. Ordinary people, in an extraordinary moment in time. Their stories fading gently into the hills. As you rest now, the bustling boomtown fades quietly behind you. The saloons close. The pans fall still. The smoke from the boarding house chimney curls slowly into a darkening sky. You've walked the length of this gold rush world, felt the rough linen of a miner's shirt, heard the quiet crackle of firelight in a cold camp, tasted the dry biscuits and gritty coffee of another time. And now, those voices drift into silence. Because, like all intense chapters in human history, the gold rush could not last. It was always fleeting, fueled by hope, worn down by labor, and eventually surrendered to time. But the stories remain, not loud or triumphant, but buried in small things, a cracked teacup, a faded photograph, a child's handwriting in a forgotten schoolbook. They speak of people trying to live ordinary lives in extraordinary conditions, trying to find comfort, purpose, and maybe just a bit of light in places where everything shimmered, but not everything shined. So as you settle deeper now into rest, let those echoes surround you. Let the footsteps of the past become soft and steady in your mind. Let the gold fields fade into twilight. The noise is gone. The dust has settled, and what's left behind is quiet. You're no longer panning, no longer digging, only breathing gently, slowly. The Boomtown has gone to sleep. And so, perhaps, should you. Good night.